Hello, everybody. I'm Byron. Today, I'm going to be talking about War and Peace. War and Peace is a very long book, but it's an easy read. It's a page turner. You can really flick through it. I listened to it as an audiobook about 10 years ago now. And back then, I didn't know what was going to happen, for one thing. So it was a bit more difficult to follow. And I thought of Pierre as the major character, and maybe Andre as well, Prince Andre. Of course, Prince Andre dies a little bit into the book. Shucks, I don't even know. I can't even give any estimation as to what sort of percentage of the way through it will be that Prince Andre dies. But this time reading it, there's definitely a third major character of Natasha. And what was interesting about Natasha, about me reading this twice, was that the first time I read it, Natasha was a grown woman, and she was just the way adults behaved. Even though I was an adult at the time, I wasn't. I was in college, and I wasn't. Natasha seemed like just an older woman. But now, when I read it again, she's a very young woman. And coquettish a bit, at least. Of course, the book lasts, I think, 10 years. So that sort of changes at the end, where she becomes, I guess, my age, maybe older. But the impression is that she's a very young woman. And her story is the one that keeps it all together. And keeping it all together is sort of what the book's about. As War and Peace in Russian is actually a pun, because the word for peace is also the word for land. And I think it was book 9, which was this is what I would call the central book of War and Peace. Book 9 is, well, now I forget a lot of what happened. But there was there was a sermon that Natasha was at. And that was where it really hit the pun of peace and land, where the preacher says peace and Natasha thinks land. Or was it the other way around? I can't even remember. I should have done this sooner. After reading the book, I should have recorded this sooner after reading the book. But it didn't. So, Natasha and a sort of modern criticism thing to do in literature is feminism and seeing the role that women played. But a lot of that is just reading back into older works, things that the author didn't put into it. But in this one, I think the author actually did put it into it. While the men are off at war, the women are back at home keeping everything together. Keeping Russia together. And there was a pretty cool scene where the Tsar has a bunch of local warlords, sort of, together. And one of them says, "We will show them how Russia rises to the defense of Russia," which was an interesting quote. And a lot of the book is about how history acts on people really rather than the other way around. So, a million or however many Frenchmen didn't move from west to east because of Napoleon. They didn't move because of the breaking of a treaty or anything like that. They moved to kill many of their fellow men. And so it's not why it happened, but it's what happened that matters in Tolstoy. And then after they move west to east, they get to Moscow, and Moscow burns. And Moscow doesn't burn because Napoleon orders it to be burned or because of an accident. Moscow burns because any city which is occupied by people who didn't build the city will burn. And then after Moscow burns, Napoleon has to retreat. And Kutuzov, that's the general that opposes Napoleon, chases him. So instead of a movement from men from west to east, there's a movement of men from east to west. And this one is a bit different than the West-East movement. And after his lengthy analysis of how Napoleon was really actually fairly insignificant and a scapegoat for the French actions. In fact, he talks about how Napoleon had a cold and how that many historians think that affected the outcome of a battle, and he says, well, that's ridiculous. It gives Kutuzov a bit of a different treatment. And Kutuzov, how do you pronounce it? I don't know. He gives him some mastery over history. He gives Kutuzov some decision making. And he says that Kutuzov decides to do certain things in order to chase Napoleon through Europe. But then, so for a while, Kutuzov, and only Kutuzov in this book, is the master of history. But once his job is done, once Napoleon is defeated, history takes control again, and Kutuzov dies. And that's the end of the war. And so Pierre comes back, and after a whole mess of Pierre being married and Natasha being engaged, Pierre decides that he loves Natasha and tries to marry her. And the book ends with him being allowed to talk to her tomorrow. And that's the end of the book. Of course, there are epilogues. And the epilogues, the first epilogue is to do with Pierre and Natasha, and it mirrors Napoleon and the French. Pierre is the master of his household, and Natasha does whatever he wants. Although this doesn't mean Pierre has the power, because Natasha is the one doing it. So in a way, it's Natasha that has the power. Even though she's not the one making the decisions, she's the one making the actions. And this mirrors Napoleon. Just because he's the one making the decisions does not mean he's the one with the power. It's the army who is acting is the one with the power. And then the fourth epilogue was just more about how history works. And that's War and Peace. It's a long book, but a very, very fun one. Worth reading at least twice. So I recommend this one. Bye.